what is blockchain, and we're also going to discuss how it impacts business. So blockchain, it's really introduced us to the next generation of the internet. There's a lot of confusion that I've seen in the marketplace around what is blockchain, and I'll start by saying this. The blockchain, it is a network. Period, hard stop. The blockchain is a network. You don't have to think beyond that to understand what the blockchain is. If you understand the internet, then you already understand what the blockchain is. The blockchain has different protocols, so it makes it a different type of network. Those different protocols have some features that I will discuss below, but I do want to make this point. The blockchain, because it's defined by protocols, it means that it can be written effectively in any language, and you see that already. The popular blockchains are Ethereum, Hyperledger, Corda, Sawtooth. There's many popular blockchains out there right now, and what they all have in common is that you can write code on them, you can write smart contracts on them in many, many different languages, because the blockchain is a network, and a network is built on protocols. It's not based on languages. So regardless of what your skill set is, or the skill set of the developers that you have in-house, odds are that there's a language out there that supports their skill sets already. And if it's not, the languages that are preferred for these blockchains are an easy reach. But there's something bigger I want to point out about the blockchain and it being defined as a network. And that is, I am old enough, I'm 45 years old, I'm old enough to remember the late 90s when the internet effectively democratized communication, so that there was now no boundaries on transactions, on transfers, at least from a communication perspective. And so in the late 90s, there was a mad scramble to try to monetize the internet. And there are some clear winners now. You can look at many of the billionaires today are people that were able to capitalize on the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s. So what we have here is a next generation internet, right? We are creating a new internet. And when you look around at all of the industries have these things in common. They all execute transactions. They all can benefit from more trust in their transactions. They all do business with a business network. So all of them have the potential to be disrupted by blockchain. The opportunities right now in blockchain, the ones that will be successful rather, are the ones that are able to figure out the use cases, go to that industry and build a blockchain network that gets adopted by a community. A blockchain focused on a business use case. That is where the opportunities are. That is why it's so disruptive. There's different types of blockchains. There's public blockchains and there's private blockchains. And I'm not going to get into a philosophical discussion about which ones are better. I'll say this, from a business perspective, whether a public blockchain is better or a private blockchain is better depends 100% on the use case that you have, 100% on that. There's pros and cons to each. Some of them regulatory, some are philosophical, but these are all the tools that you have available to you when you're evaluating a blockchain use case. So if I look at a public blockchain, it'll have these features here, right? Implemented by the protocols. It will be decentralized. It will be immutable. It will be transparent, and it will be disintermediated. And let me tell you why every one of those features are critically important to understanding the power that you have with the blockchain. If you recall, there was a company, an entity called Napster. And Napster, I think they're Rhapsody now. I honestly don't know what ended up happening to them. But the issue with Napster was architectural. They had a decentralized architecture, and it was controlled by some centralized servers. And so when there was a dispute the way to shut down the entire network was to shut down the centralized servers that control the decentralized network. If you think beyond Napster to torrents, to BitTorrents, and I'm not, again, making a philosophical argument one way or the other for torrents, but torrents, it's a decentralized collection of nodes. And that decentralized collection of nodes, it is proven to be extraordinarily difficult to take down because they are they're hyper decentralized. There is no central authority with a BitTorrent network. The issue with a BitTorrent network are that the nodes on the network, they're not really incentivized to maintain the network. So if you think about how difficult it's been for companies and for governments to shut down torrents, it shows you the value of that technology, the resiliency of that technology. When you combine torrents with incentivizing the nodes on the network, then you have the beginnings of a blockchain. Blockchains are almost directly synonymous with torrents, a torrent network, with the key exception in that it incentivizes the nodes. It incentivizes the nodes to properly maintain the network. And the incentives are the cryptocurrency for the network, and the keepers of the network are what you know as miners. That's why decentralization is important. That's the entire field of crypto economics. Because it's decentralized, you can create a self-sustaining network. That's what the blockchain provides. The fact that it's immutable, it's also another critical feature. It's immutable, and the immutability comes about because of the way hashing works. Now, I'm not going to go into hashing, but suffice it to say, what hashing algorithms allow us to do is they allow us to take large amounts of data, represent them in a single string, and that string will differ depending upon the hashing algorithm. But we can do data validation with hashing. And so we can validate the transactions that are going on our blockchain, and we can include the hash from the prior block in the new block and chain those hashes together. And if one of the blocks is validated, it will break the hash. And it doesn't mean we can't stop that from happening, but what that will tell us is that this block has been tampered with. So we know right away if any of the data that's stored on the blockchain has been tampered with. It's immutable. That's because of the hashing. Completely different from encryptions and decryptions. Hashing is primarily what provides the attribute of immutability, meaning whatever you put on the blockchain is there permanently. It's also transparent. Okay? It's transparent so that I'm going to say any authorized party can view that transaction. The benefit of that is that if I'm doing business with another company, or company A is doing business with company B, and our transactions are codified in code that we store on the blockchain, I can see the code, the other party can see the code. Any transaction goes through that code, that smart contract that exists on the blockchain. The output of that will be the results of the transactions that we store on the blockchain. What this does is not only does it provide transparency so that any authorized party can view the entire history of the ledger, you combine transparency with immutability, and what you have is you have trust. That's the main thing that those two features together give you. The immutability and the transparency, they give you trust in your transactions. That's why blockchain is often called the trust economy or the trust token economy. Because you have this new transparency on top of the immutability, and you now have trust in your transactions, what that will allow you to do is that will allow you to remove the middleman, disintermediate. Just about every public blockchain will have those features there, right? So there's not a single business that I know of that wants less trust. So let me say this differently. There's not a single reputable business that I know of that wants less trust in their transactions. There's not a single business that I know that wants less transparency. Those are public blockchains. There's an entire catalog, if you will, of private blockchains. These private blockchains have the same attributes that you see above. However, a lot of their value add, they're really for a different use case, is they add privacy and they add confidentiality. They add privacy and they add confidentiality. And this could be because of legal concerns. This could be because of business concerns. There's not a single business that I know of, if you're doing business and you're selling your goods or your services to your reseller, you're selling it to company A for $20 US per widget, and you're selling the same widgets to company B for $40 per widget, that's just terrible. That's frankly unacceptable. So in a business context, the public blockchain benefits, they simply do not work. So a private blockchain will usually have the features of being permissioned, so that you have to identify yourself. You'll have the benefits of privacy. You don't want the entire world seeing what you're doing, and you'll have the benefits of confidentiality as well. So those are the features of a private blockchain. So our friends at Block Geeks gave us a great end-to-end overview of what a typical blockchain transaction looks like. So again, someone requests a transaction in the top left. That transaction goes over to the network, and I'm just going to use the blockchain network term generically. They each do it a little bit different. They each have a different spin, but effectively that transaction goes over to the network. While it's going over to the network to be processed, there's many more transactions that are going over to this network to potentially be processed. These transactions that are going to the blockchain to be processed, they're waiting in a queue. While all of this is going on, multiple transactions are going to this network, the miners, right, the nodes that are incentivized to maintain the network, the miners are competing with each other to see who can win and have the benefit of taking all of the transactions that are sitting in the queue and adding them to the blockchain. That's the job of the miners. The miners expect to be compensated. They expect to be incentivized. They're incentivized with cryptocurrency. When they do that successfully, once we've gone through consensus and validation, we've verified that this is a good transaction, the miners put those blocks on the blockchain. Once that happens, those miners are compensated. This is in a public blockchain use case. And at that point, the transaction's complete. All of the transactions in that queue are all now in this block, in this example here, on this blockchain, and they're stored there permanently. The last entry in a triple entry accounting system, right? They're there permanently. I will say this is not the way that private blockchains work. Private blockchains are similar. However, in a private blockchain, you are incentivized to maintain the network by, well, I'm just going to call this, you have a stake in the network. It's not the proof of stake that has been defined, but you have a stake in the network if it's a private blockchain. If you're a company, you've invested in this blockchain technology, you've stood it up. then there's really no need to have the role of a miner in this network, right? So those are just other nodes that you can program to follow a different consensus algorithm to store transactions on the blockchain. The other difference with a private blockchain is the entire world does not have to see the results of that transaction. Only at least the two participants in that transaction, and possibly others, maybe an auditor, maybe a government regulator, maybe it's a small network, but everybody doesn't need to see the entire world. This would be more of a restricted, private, permissioned blockchain if this were a private blockchain. So if we go here, let's change the conversation and let's talk. That's all I want to say about what is blockchain. I want to talk now about business aspects of blockchain. Okay. And we discussed the business aspects of blockchain. It really boils down to a couple of things. One, depending upon your use case, again, there are obviously exceptions to the rules. Many entities, many businesses have in their requirements, somewhere in there, a requirement for privacy and confidentiality in their transactions. It just doesn't make sense in a lot of business contexts to have your entire history of transactions open to the entire world. You lose your competitive advantage. And so a lot of businesses are looking at private blockchains. Generation 1 blockchains were Bitcoin and Litecoin and those types of blockchains. Generation 2 blockchains were Ethereum and blockchains that included smart contracts, or what we would call smart contracts. And what I like to call Generation 3 blockchains, they had all the benefits of Generation 1 and Generation 2 blockchains. However, they also allowed for privacy and confidentiality by restricting who could access that blockchain network. So when we look at blockchain from a business perspective, in your analysis, the first thing that you have to do is to identify what your business network really is, right? Who are your customers? Who are your suppliers? Who are your partners? Who are your competitors? Does it cross regulatory boundaries? Does it cross geographical boundaries? Is there anyone that you do business with? Once you have defined that business network, that's the circle that will be used to determine who the potential participants are in your private blockchain. We know that wealth is caused by the flow of goods and services across a business network in the context of a transaction, right, which will be codified by a contract, or in blockchain parlance, a smart contract, right? So the whole concept of a market is going to be critical to this process and understanding this process. We have public use cases, just like we'll have a need for public blockchains, and we'll have private blockchain use cases as well. So these are the basic building blocks for understanding blockchain at a business level, right? Blockchain at a business level is really about business networks, right? Connecting businesses. It's about understanding who your participants are, right? What is their identity? Here's another thing to consider along that line. You can even have your identity defined as an asset itself, right? That's something separate. However, if you're analyzing blockchain from a business perspective, you have to identify who the participants are in your blockchain. As I've said a few times now, you have to identify what the assets are in your business network. And finally, you have to describe how those assets are moved around in your business network. In other words, what are the transactions? And then you also have to consider what are the rules around how those assets are moving around your network. And those rules that determine how the assets move around your network, that's your contract, right? Those are your smart contracts. That's what you'll have the developers develop. Okay. So blockchain, it is a shared, replicated, triple entry ledger system. It includes consensus, as I've mentioned already. It includes immutability. It includes finality, and it includes provenance. What we do in business is we transfer assets in the hope of building value. Anything that can be owned or anything that can be controlled to produce value is by definition an asset. And this is the point I want to make really clearly here from a business context, because what I've noticed is that the most difficult part in introducing blockchain to the business is educating the business community so that the business leaders and architects and business analysts can identify blockchain use cases. The technology, it's really not that hard to develop on the technology. The hard part has been identifying quality blockchain use cases for the business. And that starts with, as I said, understanding what the assets are in your business network. You have tangible assets and you have intangible assets. And so if you want to add real estate, for instance, to the blockchain, what you would do is you would understand that we're talking about a tangible asset. In other words, we're talking about a house, let's say. That tangible asset can be represented as an object on the network, as an asset. And we would do that by tokenizing. In this case, if it's a house, we would tokenize the deed, and the deed would represent the house. And once we do that, now we have an asset that we can move around. We can move around the blockchain. If you think about it, cash or money, it's also an asset and has the property of being anonymous, relatively anonymous. Okay. But cash, again, is only one type of asset. You have to identify the assets and the transactions in your business use case. It's all about the ledgers. Everything in blockchain is about the ledger. In blockchain, the ledgers, they are the system of record for any business. Businesses oftentimes will have several ledgers for the, each ledger will represent a different business network that they're participating in. Right? You'll have your transactions. In other words, if I sell a car or if I buy a car, right? That's very simple. That can be represented in a generation 1 technology. If, on the other hand, I have a more complicated scenario where I want to lease a car, but I want to get the car checked out before I lease it, that's more complicated. Then I probably need to have some code around that. And that's what the contract, the smart contract, provides us in a business context. This is what we're looking to do over and over in the blockchain. We're looking to find use cases where there is not 100% trust, where there are multiple ledgers, where we can have known and easily identifiable assets and transactions, so that we can go from the use case where we have multiple APIs connecting your business network, and each one of these ledgers represents the same asset. If you think about how many ledgers exist for something as simple as a car, you'll go and purchase your car. The manufacturer of that car has a record of it. The auditor, the government has a different ledger. The banks have a different ledger. The insurance companies have a different ledger. You have a different ledger. There's multiple ledgers that represent the exact same asset. And so the idea, the big idea in all of this is to identify use cases where you can create your own network, and in particular, your own business network, where you can identify the assets and transfer the assets around in your business network. That is the big idea. That's really what we're looking to do with blockchain in a business context. where there's very few use case categories. There's many implementations, many different use cases, but just use case categories. You can have blockchain as a system of record, but to do that, you have to have identified your business network. You can have blockchain as a smart contract, where you can see you can put contracts or code that represents those contracts on that network to move the assets around. And you can also use the network itself to create use cases. So let me close out by quickly going over a couple of slides here. These are some of the ways that I would recommend that you take a look at blockchain for business. Consider first deciding which participants are going to be involved, decide which assets the business is going to share. That's always going to be step one. Okay. You have to also identify who the people are you're going to be dealing with. There's many know your customer regulations across the world. KYC is important. Understand your transactions. Okay. Identify your transactions. Identify your consensus, your endorsement. And then you need to identify your privacy and your confidentiality policies. Okay. So in a business context, identity is going to be key. Okay. So blockchain for business, they're usually going to be private. And in other words, we're going to restrict who can access the business network, and your individual transactions on that network are usually going to be confidential. And lastly, when you look at patterns for customer adoption, this is a nascent technology that's early on in its life cycle. These are the typical patterns for customer adoption. You can look at use cases around compliance, a real-time view of compliance, audit use cases, key data, provenance, where you literally track the asset from its born on date until it's removed as an asset. Auditing, again, regulatory use cases. There's also the use case families of having a consortium or a shared ledger, where you have a small set of participants. For instance, you might have rental car agencies, right, will all create a private blockchain network so that they can share key reference data. For instance, if they have a do not rent list, that might be a good use case to put on a blockchain for rental car agencies. Asset exchange, you can look around and see a lot of the ICOs and how they're using the blockchain for sharing assets. The assets could be a vote. It could be a dividend notification. It could be the closing of shares of stock, right? It's all about tokenizing the assets. And finally, for high value markets, for instance, transferring helicopters and things like that. Okay. And here's the last thing I want to say before we open it up for questions. Every use case is not a good use case for a blockchain. So a key to blockchain and good blockchain adoption is identifying a good blockchain use case. Number one, blockchain should not be considered a solution in search of a problem. Blockchain should be considered if there's an already identified business problem that you cannot efficiently solve with another technology. I'm not an evangelist for blockchain at any cost. That makes no business sense. If a database makes more sense, use a database. You should have an easily identifiable business network. If you don't have a business network, then you don't have a network. You should be able to identify, at a minimum, participants, assets, and transactions in your business network. And lastly, there should be a need for trust. If you are doing business with another entity and you completely trust that other entity and you don't need to look at their records or get receipts, with the other business entity that you're doing business with, then you don't need the blockchain. However, in most cases, that is not the case. So with that being said, Sarah, I'd like to turn it back to you and ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you. So we had quite a few really great questions come in. I'm going to start with this one. So from a third-party vendor risk perspective, what are some critical items that should be assessed when approaching a blockchain vendor?
From a public blockchain perspective, the quote auditing is built in because you have complete transparency to the entire blockchain. You can go to Block Explorer or Etherscan, and you can see literally the entire history of every transaction on the blockchain. On private blockchains, however, in most of them, there's this concept called a channel. In other words, what that is that's a side blockchain, if you will, where they restrict the membership. And side channels are important for regulation because what you can do is you can identify the participants in the transaction and have them have access to that side channel. And you can also include regulators with read-only access into that side channel. And so for private blockchains, that use case is really built into several of them. I can say that with confidence, built into the framework of how these private blockchains work.
What would be an example of how this technology will disrupt a business?
In cryptocurrency, we're approaching $1 trillion that's going across all of it daily. It has already disrupted the banking industry. That's indisputable. You can go anywhere, anytime, and see that the money that was in cryptocurrency, that money used to go through the banks. It's already disrupted the banking industry. You can also look at the supply chain, where you can now track if you have radishes, for instance, being grown in South America. You can put an IoT device on it and track that radish from the time it is pulled out of the ground until it's served on someone's plate. And supply chain, you've seen use cases already that have been implemented. You can look at Google Drive and Dropbox.com and Box.com. People have realized that the hard drive space on people's laptops that are connected to the blockchain is an asset, and they're selling it. So you see companies like Storage, STORJ.io, disrupting that already disrupted cloud industry. I was speaking to the president of a auto manufacturer, and they realized that blockchain was potentially disruptive to them, an auto manufacturer, because they came to the conclusion that if they allow another entity to create a blockchain network that represented every part on their vehicle, then that would be the trusted source of information for that vehicle. And that meant that any transaction that involved that vehicle would have to go through that network, because that would be the trusted source of information. And they realized that they could not allow that to happen. So that's, if you're a business, that's the threat that exists, is that if you're not watching your, the hind flank, that somebody's going to come behind you and create a blockchain network that becomes the trusted token economy for your assets.